The dog's whimper broke the silence. In the dimly lit apartment, Thomas Bishop sat motionless in his chair, his fingers wrapped around an old military dog tag, the name nearly rubbed away by time. Across from him, Riley, his aging German shepherd, lay curled on a threadbare rug, his cloudy eyes locked onto his master with quiet understanding. Then came the knock. 3 sharp raps against the door, urgent, deliberate. Thomas stiffened. No one ever knocked. Not anymore. The air inside the apartment was thick with the scent of old books, leather, and faint traces of gun oil. Thomas remained still, his pulse steady but his grip on the dog tag tightening. His eyes flickered toward the door. Riley let out a low growl. Another knock, louder this time. Thomas's instincts, honed by years in combat, kicked in. He reached beneath the side table, his fingers grazing the cold steel of his sidearm. He hadn't needed it in years, but something about this knock felt wrong. A voice followed, muffled through the heavy door. "Mr. Bishop, open up. We need to talk." Thomas recognized the tone before he recognized the voice. Official, firm, and carrying the weight of unspoken consequences. He exhaled slowly, running a hand over his face. Government? Military? Someone from the past? He glanced at Riley, whose ears were now pricked, his body tense. The dog could still sense danger before Thomas did, and right now, Riley was on edge. Thomas rose, his joints protesting as he moved toward the door. The last time someone had come looking for him unannounced, it had cost him everything. He unlatched the deadbolt, but didn't open it all the way. The hallway outside was dim, revealing a man in a dark suit, his expression unreadable. Behind him, another figure stood near the stairwell, hands clasped in front of them like a sentry. The man in the suit cleared his throat. "Mr. Bishop, there's been a development. Something you need to see." Thomas didn't move. "I don't do developments anymore." The man exhaled, glancing briefly down the hallway before stepping closer, lowering his voice. "This isn't about you. It's about the dog." Behind him, Riley let out a sharp bark, his body lowering into a defensive stance. Thomas felt a chill crawl up his spine. He had spent years keeping his past buried. But now, something, or someone, was digging it back up. Thomas didn't respond right away. His grip on the door tightened, his knuckles turning white. The man in the suit met his gaze with a steady calmness, but there was something else beneath it, urgency. A quiet insistence that whatever he had to say wasn't a request. Riley's growl deepened, his old but powerful body shifting forward like he was preparing to defend his home. Thomas placed a hand on the dog's back, a silent signal. Not yet. The second figure near the stairwell moved slightly, shifting their weight. "Watching. Waiting." "Explain," Thomas finally said, his voice low, measured. The man in the suit hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "It's classified, but we need to move quickly. There's a warrant out for Riley." The words hit like a gut punch. "A warrant? For a dog?" Thomas repeated, his voice edged with disbelief. The man nodded. "More than that. Someone's coming for him. If we don't act now, you won't have a say in what happens next." Thomas's mind raced. Riley had been his partner, his lifeline, the only thing left from the days when his uniform meant something. After the war, after the incident that sent him into isolation, Riley had been deemed unfit for further service and given to Thomas as a companion, a final show of gratitude from a system that otherwise discarded him. But now, years later, they wanted him back. "Why now?" Thomas asked, his voice tight. "What changed?" The man glanced over his shoulder before answering. "Because Riley isn't just a retired service dog. He's evidence." A deep, cold dread settled in Thomas's chest. He thought he had left it all behind. The mission that went wrong, the orders that made no sense, the cover-up that followed. But if they were coming for Riley, then someone had dug up the past. And if the past was coming back, it meant someone wanted him silenced, too. A noise echoed from the far end of the hallway. A door opening, footsteps approaching. The second figure by the stairwell tensed, touching the radio clipped to their jacket. "We're out of time," the man in the suit muttered. "We need to go? Now." Thomas's gaze flickered toward Riley, who stood alert at his side, sensing the shift in the air. He had 2 choices, stay and fight, or leave and find out why. After all these years, someone wanted his dog dead. Thomas's heartbeat pounded in his ears, his mind racing through possibilities. Every instinct told him to stand his ground, to demand answers, But the urgency in the man's voice, the tension in the air, this wasn't a request. It was a warning. Riley let out a low, uneasy rumble, his stance shifting as the footsteps from the far end of the hallway grew closer. The second figure near the stairwell adjusted their position, angling toward the approaching presence. Thomas clenched his jaw. If someone was coming for Riley, they wouldn't be knocking politely. The man in the suit took a step forward. "Thomas, listen to me. If you want to save your dog, you need to trust me." Trust. That was a word he hadn't believed in for years. But Riley? Riley was everything. The moment stretched thin, every second dragging like a loaded trigger. The footsteps turned the corner. A shadow moved just beyond the flickering hallway light. Then, bang! The door at the far end of the hall burst open. A figure in tactical gear surged through, weapon raised, eyes locking onto Thomas in an instant. Down on the ground. Now, Riley bared his teeth, the deep growl in his throat turning to a snarl. Thomas didn't move. His instincts kicked in, scanning the room for options, for cover, for escape. He wasn't armed, but he knew how to fight. The man in the suit lifted a hand, stepping in front of Thomas. "Stand down," he barked at the intruder. "This isn't the way." The gun didn't lower. The figure in tactical gear took another step forward. "Thomas Hale, you are under federal investigation. Surrender the animal immediately." The words sliced through the air like a blade. Surrender. Like Riley was some stolen piece of property. Thomas had seen this kind of move before. The intimidation, the force-first approach. They weren't here for explanations. They weren't here for justice. They were here to take his dog. And if he let them, he would never see Riley again. His hands curled into fists, his breath steady despite the chaos tightening around him. He had faced worse. He had survived worse. But Riley wasn't just a dog. He was the last piece of a life Thomas had fought to protect. The hallway seemed to shrink, time slowing to a razor-thin moment of decision. He could comply, hand over Riley, and hope for answers later. Or he could fight his way out and find the truth himself. The second figure by the stairwell shifted. The man in the suit inhaled sharply. Riley's growl deepened. And Thomas? He made his choice. Thomas didn't hesitate. His body moved before his mind could catch up, years of training kicking in like muscle memory. With a sharp tug, he yanked Riley's leash, signaling him to stay close. In a split second, he lunged toward the man in the suit, gripping his wrist and twisting hard. The man staggered back, caught off guard. The figure in tactical gear reacted instantly, stepping forward to seize control of the situation, but Thomas was faster. With a sharp pivot, he grabbed the back of a wooden chair nearby and hurled it straight into the path of the advancing agent. The impact wasn't enough to stop him, but it was enough to buy a few seconds. Riley, sensing the shift in energy, stayed close to Thomas's side, his ears pinned back, his muscles tensed. "Thomas, don't make this worse," the man in the suit snapped, regaining his footing. "Worse?" Thomas scoffed, his voice low, controlled. "You just broke into my home, pointed a gun at me, and tried to take my dog. Explain how this gets any worse." The suited man's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, the agent in tactical gear moved again. Thomas barely had time to react before the agent lunged forward, reaching for his shoulder. With a swift motion, Thomas sidestepped, grabbing the agent's arm and using his own momentum against him. The agent stumbled forward, slamming into the wall with a grunt. Thomas didn't wait for him to recover. "Riley, move," he commanded. Without hesitation, Riley darted toward the open stairwell, his paws barely making a sound against the wooden floor. Thomas followed, sprinting after his dog as the chaos behind him erupted. "Stop him!" The words rang out, followed by the sound of heavy boots pounding against the floor. Thomas reached the stairs and took them two at a time, his mind racing. He had no idea how deep this went, but he knew one thing for sure. Whoever these people were, they weren't here to play fair. As he hit the ground floor, he scanned the area, looking for an exit. The back door. If he could make it outside, disappear into the night, he'd have a chance. But just as he turned the corner, he froze. A black SUV sat idling just outside the back door, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Two more men stood by the vehicle, their silhouettes rigid, waiting. Trapped. Thomas clenched his jaw. He wasn't going down without a fight. Thomas exhaled slowly, calculating his next move. The two men by the SUV weren't just standing there, they were ready. One had his hand resting near his hip, where a weapon was likely holstered, while the other was gripping a radio, waiting for the signal to move. Riley let out a low growl. His body pressed against Thomas's leg, sensing the danger ahead. Behind them, the heavy boots of the agents inside were closing in. Trapped between a wall of armed men and a quickly tightening net, Thomas knew he had seconds, maybe less, to act. The only way out was through. He shifted his stance, muscles coiled like a spring. His mind raced through years of combat experience, searching for an opening. Then, a voice cut through the tense air. "Thomas Hale." The man with the radio stepped forward, his expression unreadable. His tone was calm, measured, as if he had all the time in the world. "You don't want to do this." Thomas said nothing, his breathing steady, his fists clenched. The man gestured slightly toward the SUV. "Get in the car. No one gets hurt." Thomas scoffed. "That's so? Because from where I'm standing, it sure looks like I'm outnumbered, outgunned, and you've already broken into my home. Forgive me if I don't take your word for it." The man sighed, shaking his head as if disappointed. Then, he gave a single nod. The other guard's hand moved fast, reaching for his sidearm. Thomas reacted instantly. With a swift pivot, he grabbed a nearby metal trash can and hurled it forward. It struck the guard's wrist, sending his aim off as he stumbled back. At the same moment, Thomas reached down, scooping up a handful of gravel from the edge of the driveway. He flung it into the second man's face, causing him to flinch as dust and debris filled his eyes. Riley barked, leaping forward and snapping at the distracted guard's leg, forcing him to stumble. Thomas didn't hesitate. He grabbed Riley by the collar and bolted toward the nearest cover, a row of parked cars along the side of the house. Gunfire erupted behind him. The sharp crack of bullets cutting through the night sent a chill down his spine, but he kept moving. He dove behind a car as a bullet shattered the side mirror inches from his head. Breath coming fast, heart pounding, he risked a glance. The suited man was still standing by the SUV, watching, not firing. He wasn't here to kill Thomas. Not yet. That meant they needed him alive. But why? Another shot rang out, striking the pavement near his feet. No time to think. Thomas spotted a gap in the hedge at the edge of the property. If he could make it there, he and Riley could disappear into the woods behind the house. Another burst of gunfire. The escape wouldn't be easy, but Thomas had survived worse, and he wasn't about to let them win. Thomas tightened his grip on Riley's collar, muscles tensed as he calculated his next move. The hedge was his best chance, but the open stretch between him and the tree line was a kill zone. He needed a distraction, a flicker of movement in his peripheral vision. One of the men was circling wide, trying to cut off his escape. They were closing in fast. A voice rang out again, calm but firm. "Last chance, Hale. Make this easy on yourself." Thomas clenched his jaw. That voice, it had authority, but not desperation. These men weren't just hired muscle. They had orders, a chain of command. He took a breath, forcing his mind to focus. He had seconds. A quick scan of his surroundings. His car was too far, the front door was compromised, and the men were too well armed for a straight fight. His gaze flicked to a garden hose coiled near the porch. Not a weapon, but enough to buy him a moment. Keeping low, he grabbed the hose and twisted the nozzle hard, sending a sudden high-pressure stream of water arcing toward the nearest man. The moment the water struck his face, Thomas lunged. He drove his shoulder into the man's gut, knocking him off balance. A sharp grunt escaped his opponent as he stumbled back, giving Thomas just enough time to wrench the pistol from his grip. He fired once. A warning shot, aimed at the ground between him and the others. The reaction was immediate. One man ducked, the other hesitated, and that split second was all Thomas needed. "Go, Riley." With a sharp command, he released his grip on the dog's collar. Riley took off, darting toward the hedge. Thomas followed, vaulting over the hood of a car as another shot rang out behind him. A sharp sting burned across his shoulder, grazed. The pain barely registered as he hit the ground running, feet pounding against the dirt. He dove through the hedge just as another bullet splintered the wooden fence beside him. Branches whipped against his face, thorns tearing at his arms as he crashed through the dense undergrowth. Riley was ahead, his lean body cutting effortlessly through the brush. The moment they reached the tree line, Thomas ducked behind a thick oak, pressing his back against the rough bark. He needed to think. They weren't trying to kill him outright. That much was clear. But they were willing to wound him. Keep him weak, keep him contained. That meant they needed him alive. But for what? A rustling sound to his left. Too close. Thomas barely had time to react before a figure emerged from the trees, moving with precision. Not one of the agents. Someone else. Someone waiting for him. Thomas barely had time to raise the stolen pistol before the figure stepped into a sliver of moonlight. A hood covered most of their face, but the stance, the controlled movements, it was someone trained. Someone dangerous. Riley let out a low growl, his body tense. Thomas tightened his grip on the gun, keeping his breathing steady. "Who are you?" Thomas asked, his voice edged with caution. The figure didn't answer right away. Instead, they tilted their head slightly, as if assessing him. Then, in a quiet but firm voice, they spoke. "If you want to survive the night, put that gun down and follow me." Thomas didn't move. His pulse pounded in his ears. Trusting a stranger in a situation like this? Stupid. But staying put meant the men from the house would catch up any second. "Why should I trust you?" he pressed. A faint smirk played on the figure's lips. "Because they want you alive." "I don't." A sharp crack echoed from behind, branches snapping under heavy boots. The pursuers were closing in. Thomas had seconds to decide. He could keep running blind through the woods, hoping to lose them. Or he could take a gamble on this unknown variable standing in front of him. The stranger turned, slipping deeper into the shadows. Riley whined softly, shifting on his paws, waiting for Thomas to decide. Footsteps grew louder. Thomas clenched his jaw. No choice. He took off after the stranger, keeping low as he moved. Riley followed close behind. They wove through the trees, moving fast but careful, each step deliberate. Thomas kept his finger near the trigger, watching the stranger's every move. Finally, after several minutes of running, they reached a clearing. A dark SUV was parked near a dirt road, engine running, headlights off. The stranger gestured toward it. "Get in." Thomas hesitated. This was too clean, too prepared. "Who are you?" he demanded again. This time, the stranger turned, just enough for the moonlight to reveal part of their face. A sharp jawline, a faint scar across the cheek. Eyes that held no fear. "Someone who knows what's coming for you," they said. "And trust me, you don't want to be around when they find you." A shout rang out from the woods behind them, closer than before. No time. Thomas exhaled sharply, then opened the car door and slid in. The stranger got behind the wheel. Tires spun against the dirt as the SUV roared forward, disappearing into the night. The SUV sped down the narrow dirt road, tires kicking up dust as the trees blurred past. Thomas kept his grip firm on the gun, his heartbeat matching the rhythm of the engine's growl. Riley sat on the seat beside him, ears twitching, sensing the tension in the air. The stranger hadn't said a word since they'd taken off. Their hands were steady on the wheel, their gaze locked on the road ahead, navigating the twists and turns with practiced ease. Thomas clenched his jaw. He needed answers. "Who are you really?" he demanded, shifting slightly in his seat to keep the gun in view. The stranger didn't flinch. "Someone who doesn't have time for this conversation." "That's not good enough." The stranger let out a sharp breath, but didn't take their eyes off the road. "Your name's been flagged. Someone wants you alive, but only long enough to take something from you. After that, you're disposable." Thomas felt a cold weight settle in his chest. "Who?" A beat of silence. Then, "You already know." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. Memories flashed, fragments of whispered conversations, the feeling of being watched, the sudden betrayal that had sent him running in the first place. The company, the ones he had worked for, the ones he had trusted, the ones who had left him for dead. His grip on the gun tightened. "You're telling me they've been after me this whole time?" The stranger nodded. "And they're closer than you think." Almost as if on cue, headlights flared to life behind them, cutting through the dark. A second later, the roar of engines shattered the quiet. Thomas turned sharply. 3 black SUVs were closing in, fast. "Hold on," the stranger muttered. The SUV lurched forward as they stomped on the gas, swerving onto a side road that barely looked wide enough to drive through. The branches scraped against the sides of the vehicle like skeletal fingers. Gunfire erupted behind them. Bullets pinged against the metal, one shattering the back window. Riley let out a sharp bark and ducked low. Thomas turned and fired a shot through the broken glass, aiming at the lead vehicle. The driver swerved, but kept coming. "They won't stop," the stranger said, gripping the wheel tighter. Thomas fired again. This time, the shot hit the tire of the nearest SUV. It skidded sideways, crashing into a tree. The other two vehicles pushed forward, undeterred. The road ahead suddenly split. One path led to a rocky hill, the other toward a barely visible bridge over a river. The stranger glanced at the rearview mirror. "Hope you can swim." Before Thomas could respond, the SUV veered sharply toward the bridge. Behind them, the remaining pursuers stayed close, relentless. Then, just as they reached the bridge, one of the SUVs behind them slammed into the railing, flipping over the edge in a violent crash. But the last one was still there, and gaining. The last SUV surged forward, its engine howling as it closed the distance. Thomas could see the driver now, shadowed behind the wheel, but determined. The headlights cast long, eerie beams against the cracked wooden planks of the bridge. The stranger gritted their teeth and yanked the wheel sharply. The tires screeched against the worn wood, and for a terrifying second, the vehicle lurched sideways, nearly skidding off the edge. The river below raged in the darkness, its waters swelling with recent rain, ready to swallow anything that fell in. Thomas braced himself, gripping the handle above the window. Riley whimpered, low and tense, his eyes darting between the road and the threat behind them. Gunfire rang out again. The back windshield shattered, glass spraying over the seats. The stranger didn't flinch, pushing the gas pedal to the floor. Thomas twisted in his seat and took aim. His pulse pounded in his ears as he fired twice. The first bullet hit the hood of the pursuing SUV, but the second. The driver swerved at the last second, avoiding the shot. Instead of slowing down, they accelerated, ramming the back of Thomas's vehicle with brutal force. The impact sent them jerking forward. The SUV skidded wildly, tires barely gripping the slick wood. For a moment, the bridge groaned beneath them, as if deciding whether it could handle the chaos. "Hold on," the stranger shouted. Thomas barely had time to react before the SUV launched off the bridge's edge. Everything seemed to move in slow motion. The feeling of weightlessness, the rush of cold air, the dark waters below rising to meet them. Then, impact. The vehicle slammed into the river, the force of the crash sending a violent shock through Thomas's body. The freezing water rushed in immediately, filling the SUV's interior. For a moment, everything was disorienting. Water, darkness, the muffled sounds of the world above fading as they sank. Thomas's instincts took over. He fumbled for his seatbelt, his fingers numb from the cold. Riley thrashed beside him, his paws scrabbling against the door. The stranger moved fast, already working to get free. They turned to Thomas, their voice barely audible over the gurgling water. "Out. Now." Thomas sucked in what little air was left and slammed his shoulder against the door. It didn't budge. The SUV was sinking fast. The river's current pulled at them, twisting the vehicle sideways as if it were nothing more than a toy. The headlights flickered once, then died, plunging them into complete darkness. Water surged into the SUV, rising fast. The icy current clawed at Thomas's legs, numbing his muscles, making every movement sluggish. Riley let out a strangled whimper, his claws scratching frantically against the submerged door. The vehicle tilted, nose sinking first, the weight of the engine pulling them down. Thomas slammed his shoulder against the door again. Still stuck. The pressure outside was too strong. His breath came in short, sharp gasps, fogging what little remained of the shattered windshield. The stranger, already half submerged, moved with terrifying calm. They unbuckled their seatbelt and twisted toward the console, searching for something. In the dim, flickering light of the dashboard, their expression was unreadable. Thomas struggled against the rising water. His chest burned, lungs tightening. He reached for Riley, gripping the dog's soaked fur, trying to keep his head above the swirling current. A click. The stranger had found a knife. Without hesitation, they drove it into the airbag module and twisted, forcing the blade deep. A sharp hiss filled the space as the air released. Then, they shifted, pressing their back against the seat, bracing their feet against the windshield. "Brace yourself," they muttered. Before Thomas could react, the stranger kicked. The windshield groaned, cracked, then shattered outward. Water rushed in, filling every inch of space, dragging them down with violent force. Thomas grabbed Riley and kicked off the sinking floorboard, pushing toward the opening. The cold was unbearable, wrapping around his chest like iron bands. His limbs felt sluggish, but he forced himself forward. The stranger was already outside, swimming hard against the river's current. Thomas followed, his grip on Riley never loosening. The weight of his soaked clothing made every stroke harder, but he pushed on. The surface felt impossibly far away. His lungs screamed. The world blurred. The river's pull was relentless, dragging them sideways, away from the bridge, away from the shore. The headlights of the other SUV still glowed faintly above the waterline, casting eerie beams into the depths. Shapes moved along the bridge, figures silhouetted against the dim glow of distant streetlights. More men, more danger. Thomas broke the surface with a desperate gasp, sucking in air as he fought against the current. Riley coughed, paddling weakly beside him. The stranger grabbed Thomas's jacket, steadying him. "We need to move. Now." Their voice was raw, urgent. Thomas turned, scanning the riverbank. There, a cluster of reeds, a patch of land barely visible beyond the swirling waters. It was their only chance. Behind them, on the bridge, a figure raised something, a weapon, reflecting the dull glow of headlights. Then, a gunshot split the night. The gunshot cracked through the air, sending a shockwave of fear through Thomas's already exhausted body. A sharp splash erupted just inches away, the bullet slicing through the water. Riley yelped, his body flinching at the impact nearby. Thomas sucked in a breath and kicked harder, forcing his aching limbs to move. The current was relentless, dragging them further downstream, away from the bridge, but not fast enough to escape the line of fire. Another shot rang out. The stranger cursed under their breath, grabbing Thomas's arm and yanking him toward the reeds ahead. "Keep your head down," they growled. Thomas didn't argue. He ducked lower, his body half submerged, pulling Riley close as they fought against the river's pull. His chest burned, his legs screamed for rest, but there was no stopping now. Not when death was so close behind. Up on the bridge, more figures moved. The glow of headlights illuminated them in fractured glimpses, dark silhouettes shifting, pointing, shouting. The distant rumble of an engine sent a fresh wave of panic through him. They weren't just shooting. They were coming. The reeds loomed ahead, swaying in the wind, their long blades reaching over the water like desperate fingers. The stranger reached them first, using the thick vegetation to drag themselves onto the muddy bank. "Come on," they hissed, extending a hand. Thomas grabbed it, using the last of his strength to hoist himself up. His boots sank into the wet earth, the weight of his soaked clothes nearly pulling him back under. Riley scrambled beside him, shaking violently, his breath coming in ragged pants. Another shot. This time, it tore through the reeds, snapping stalks like brittle twigs. "Move," the stranger urged, already pushing forward, keeping low as they ran toward the cover of a cluster of trees up ahead. Thomas forced his legs to obey. His body ached, exhaustion clawing at every fiber of his being, but he couldn't stop. Not now. Not when the enemy was closing in. Behind them, a vehicle skidded to a halt on the dirt road parallel to the river. Doors slammed. Flashlights flicked on, sweeping the area in erratic beams of white light. They were being hunted. Riley whimpered, but Thomas shushed him, pressing his hand gently against the dog's side as they ducked behind a fallen log. He could hear voices now, low, angry murmurs. They didn't drown. One of the men grumbled. "Find them." A new voice, colder, more calculating, cut through the night. No mistakes this time. The beams of light swept closer. Footsteps crunched against the damp earth. Thomas held his breath. A branch snapped just feet away. The footsteps grew closer, slow and deliberate, crunching over twigs and damp earth. Thomas could hear the faint rustling of fabric, the metallic clink of a weapon shifting in someone's grip. Riley's body trembled against his side, the dog's ears pinned back in fear. The stranger crouched beside Thomas, gripping his arm in warning. Their breath was shallow, their posture tense. They were listening, waiting, calculating. A flashlight beam sliced through the darkness, sweeping just inches above their heads. The glare reflected off the wet bark of the fallen log, sending a dull sheen across the muddy ground. Thomas could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears, his pulse hammering against his skull. "They've got to be close," one of the men muttered. "No way they made it far in this mess." Another voice, gruff and impatient, responded, then spread out. "I don't want this turning into another disaster." Thomas swallowed hard. Another disaster? Just how many people had these men hunted before? The sound of boots moving in opposite directions sent a chill through him. They were fanning out, combing the area inch by inch. If they stayed where they were, it was only a matter of time before. A sharp rustle. Thomas barely had time to react before a dark shape loomed over them. The man was fast, his flashlight cutting straight down toward their hiding spot. The moment the beam hit Riley's fur, the dog let out a low, warning growl. The man's reaction was instant. There they are. A gunshot exploded in the air. The stranger lunged, tackling Thomas to the ground just as the bullet split through the air above his head. Dirt and leaves scattered in all directions. Riley barked, his body tense to attack, but Thomas grabbed his collar, holding him back. "Run," the stranger barked. But where? The trees around them provided cover, but not enough. The river was too close, too dangerous. The road above was crawling with men. Another gunshot. Bark shattered from a nearby tree, sending splinters flying. "Go," the stranger snapped, yanking Thomas to his feet and shoving him forward. With no other choice, Thomas ran. Riley bolted beside him, his paws kicking up mud. The forest blurred past them, shadows twisting, branches clawing at his clothes. He could hear the men shouting behind him, their boots thudding hard against the ground. They weren't just chasing anymore. They were hunting. Thomas's lungs burned as he sprinted through the thick undergrowth, his boots slipping on the damp earth. Riley stayed close, his breath ragged, paws pounding against the ground. The voices behind them grew more distant, but the gunfire hadn't stopped. Another shot rang out, splintering a branch just inches from Thomas's head. The stranger who had helped him was nowhere in sight. Had they been hit? Taken down? Thomas didn't have time to look back. He could hear the pursuers crashing through the woods, their shouts growing sharper, more frantic. "Fan out. Cut them off at the ridge." Thomas clenched his jaw. They were trying to corner him, drive him toward a dead end. His mind raced through the layout of the area. He had hiked these woods countless times before. There was a steep ravine not far ahead, a rocky drop-off that could mean death if he wasn't careful. But if he stayed on this path, they would box him in before he could find a way around. He had to make a choice. A faint glimmer of water caught his eye through the trees. The river. If they could reach it, maybe they could lose the men in the current. But that meant one thing: jumping. Riley let out a sharp whimper as another gunshot cracked through the air. A bullet struck the ground just a few feet away, kicking up dirt. They were closing in fast. Thomas veered left, pushing his legs harder than ever before. His muscles screamed, his breath came in ragged gasps. The edge of the ravine was just ahead. He could hear the rush of water below, the current raging against the rocks. A voice shouted from behind. "He's heading for the drop." They knew. More shots. Bark exploded from a nearby tree, debris raining down over him. The ground beneath his feet turned slick with moisture. His body lurched forward, momentum carrying him toward the edge. Then, a hand grabbed his arm. Fingers dug into his sleeve, yanking him back with a force that nearly knocked the wind out of him. Thomas twisted, his heart slamming against his ribs. The stranger. Their face was shadowed, eyes sharp with urgency. "Not that way," they hissed. Before Thomas could respond, the ground trembled beneath them. The pursuers were closing in, their footsteps a relentless drumbeat against the earth. The stranger's grip tightened. "We need another way out. Now." Thomas barely had a second to process before the stranger yanked him into the thick brush, pulling him down just as a fresh round of gunfire erupted. Riley let out a low growl but followed, staying close as the three of them ducked behind a fallen log. Through the gaps in the branches, Thomas could see dark figures moving through the trees, their flashlights sweeping the area. The beams of light flickered dangerously close, casting long shadows that danced over the damp ground. "Where'd he go?" one of the men snarled. Another voice, calmer but colder, answered. "He's close. He won't run forever." The stranger beside Thomas tensed. Their grip on his arm tightened for a brief moment before they slowly released him. Thomas turned his head slightly, whispering, "Who are you?" The stranger didn't respond. Instead, they pointed toward the river, then motioned for him to stay quiet. Thomas swallowed hard. He didn't like it, trusting someone whose name he didn't even know, but right now, he had no choice. The men above them were still searching, their boots crunching against dead leaves. One of them stopped just a few feet away from their hiding spot. Thomas held his breath, Riley's fur bristling against his leg. A radio crackled to life. "He's got nowhere left to go. Keep pushing toward the ridge." The man muttered something under his breath, then moved on. Thomas exhaled, but just as he did, Riley let out a quiet whimper. It was barely a sound, but it was enough. The man froze mid-step. Thomas saw the way his head snapped toward them, his grip tightening on his weapon. His flashlight swung toward the log. The stranger reacted fast, reaching into their jacket and pulling something small from their pocket. A rock. With a quick flick of their wrist, they sent it flying toward the opposite side of the woods. It hit the ground with a sharp crack. The man spun toward the sound. "There!" he shouted, raising his weapon. In an instant, the others redirected their lights, moving toward the noise. The stranger grabbed Thomas's sleeve, their voice barely above a whisper. "Move. Now." Heart pounding, Thomas crawled backward, keeping low as they slipped deeper into the shadows. Riley followed silently, his ears pressed flat against his head. The river wasn't far now, but the men weren't giving up. And something told Thomas that reaching the water wouldn't be the end of this chase. It would only be the beginning. The cold night air wrapped around Thomas as he followed the stranger, his breath shallow, his pulse hammering in his ears. Riley stayed close, his body tense, ears flicking at every distant sound. The river was within reach now, its dark waters rushing over jagged rocks, the current fast and unforgiving. But the men were closing in. A voice cut through the darkness behind them. "Fan out. He's here somewhere." Thomas glanced over his shoulder, his stomach twisting at the sight of flashlight beams bouncing through the trees, sweeping dangerously close. The men were spreading out, their movements precise, methodical. They weren't just searching, they were hunting. The stranger didn't hesitate. They grabbed Thomas's arm, guiding him down a narrow slope, careful to keep their steps quiet on the loose dirt. The ground was slick from recent rain, and Thomas's boot nearly slipped, but he caught himself just in time. Riley let out a low growl. The stranger turned sharply, eyes narrowing. "Keep him quiet." Thomas ran a hand over Riley's head, whispering softly, though he knew the dog could sense the tension crackling in the air. A sudden sound, a snap of a twig, froze them in place. Thomas's breath hitched. A shadow moved to his left, just beyond the tree line. One of the men was close. Too close. The beam of his flashlight swept across the ground, illuminating damp leaves, gnarled roots, and footprints, fresh footprints. Thomas felt the stranger tense beside him. He clenched his fists. If they were seen, there would be no running. Not through this uneven terrain. Not with a river at their backs. The man with the flashlight took another step. Then another. Thomas swallowed hard, his mind racing. Could they take him down silently? Would it buy them time? But before he could decide, another voice called out from the distance. "Anything." The man hesitated, his flashlight lingering on the ground just inches from their hiding spot. A moment of silence stretched, thick with suspense. Then, "Nothing yet," the man muttered. He turned away. Thomas exhaled, his heart pounding. But there was no relief. Because now, the men were spreading further out, cutting off every possible path forward. And as the stranger's eyes met his, Thomas saw the unspoken truth in them. They were running out of options. The moment the flashlight beam disappeared, Thomas finally let out a slow breath, but the relief was short-lived. The men weren't giving up, they were just changing their approach. The sound of footsteps scattered in multiple directions, their voices growing more distant, yet still present, weaving a tightening net around them. The stranger motioned silently for Thomas to move, and he followed, Riley padding alongside him, ears pinned back in caution. The ground sloped downward, and every step sent small rocks tumbling. Thomas fought the urge to curse under his breath. They needed silence. The river's roar grew louder. Thomas could see it now, just past the trees, its dark waters rushing with violent force. He'd hoped it would be a possible escape, but looking at the speed of the current, the thought of being pulled under sent a chill through him. Behind them, a voice rang out. "Tracks." He went this way. Thomas's pulse spiked. Heavy boots pounded against the damp earth, closing in fast. They had seconds. The stranger grabbed his arm, yanking him into a crouch. "We have to cross," they whispered urgently. "It's the only way." Thomas's eyes darted back to the river. The waters churned angrily, frothing over jagged rocks. One misstep, and they'd be swallowed whole. Riley whined softly. Thomas's chest tightened. He could swim, But Riley. No time, the stranger hissed. They're coming. The urgency in their voice made Thomas glance back. Flashlights bobbed between the trees, beams sweeping dangerously close. One of the men raised his voice, his tone sharp. You can't run forever, soldier. Come out. Make this easy. A cold realization settled over Thomas. They weren't just chasing him. They were taunting him. They weren't planning to take him alive. He met the stranger's gaze, then looked at Riley, who stood tense beside him. The dog had been by his side through battles, through loss, through years of loneliness. Thomas had always protected him. He wouldn't fail him now. Swallowing his fear, he nodded. The stranger didn't hesitate. They turned and leaped into the river. The current grabbed them instantly, pulling them downstream. Thomas inhaled sharply, then turned to Riley. Stay close, he whispered. Then, before he could think twice, he grabbed Riley and jumped. The freezing water crashed over them, pulling them under. The world twisted into chaos. The moment Thomas hit the water, the current yanked him under, twisting him in the dark, icy depths. Riley thrashed beside him, his paws scrambling, his breath escaping in frantic bursts. Thomas fought against the pull, tightening his grip on Riley, kicking hard toward the surface. They broke through the water just as the flashlights reached the riverbank. The men stood frozen for a moment, their beams slicing through the misty air, searching the violent waters. One of them cursed. They won't make it, another muttered. But they didn't leave. They waited. The river carried Thomas and Riley away from their pursuers, but the battle wasn't over. The weight of exhaustion pressed down on Thomas, his muscles aching from the relentless pull of the current. Cold seeped into his bones, but he refused to let go. A jagged branch jutted out from the shore ahead. Thomas lunged, his fingers wrapping around the rough bark. He gritted his teeth and heaved himself up, using the last of his strength to pull Riley with him. They collapsed onto the muddy bank, gasping, shivering, alive. For a long moment, Thomas lay still, staring at the sky, the sounds of rushing water drowning out the distant voices of the men who had hunted him. They were far now, maybe far enough. But the weight of everything, the chase, the fear, the unknown, still pressed against his chest. Riley nudged his arm, his wet fur sticking to Thomas's skin. A quiet reassurance. They had survived, but at what cost? The night stretched on as Thomas and Riley found temporary shelter beneath a thick canopy of trees. The stranger, his unexpected ally, had disappeared in the chaos, but their words lingered. You can't run forever. Thomas knew that was true. He had spent too long looking over his shoulder, trapped in a life that refused to let him go. And now, with nowhere left to turn, he had to face it. By dawn, exhaustion pulled at him, but his mind was clear. He wasn't the man they thought he was. He had done nothing wrong. It was time to stop running. Riley sat beside him, his tail wagging weakly as the sun rose over the treetops. Thomas ran a hand over his fur, taking in the warmth of the morning. Maybe it was time to fight back. He stood, shoulders squared, eyes set on the road ahead. Whatever came next, he wouldn't face it alone. Because some battles weren't fought with weapons. Some were fought with resilience, with truth, with an unbreakable bond. And this was a battle he was finally ready to win. As Thomas and Riley disappeared into the horizon, a new journey began, not of escape, but of redemption. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow us for more powerful and emotional stories.